IronOverload.io hardcore episode coming your way, episode 66. Today we're doing an updated version of talking about Dianabol. And this is to bulk. And Dianabol has a really rich history. It's one of Mobster's favorites, one of the most dummy-proof oral steroids out there. And we're going to talk about it. We're going to tell you all about its history, how to use it, and all that good stuff. So first, it was called Methandrostenolone, and it was first described in 55, synthesized by Ciba Labs in Switzerland. They filed a U.S. patent in 57. They began marketing the drug as Dianabol in 58 in the United States. Initially, burn victims and the elderly were prescribed this hormone. And look, it was prescribed off-label as a pharmaceutical performance enhancement to weightlifters and other athletes as well. And one of the early adopters, Oklahoma University San Diego Chargers head coach Sid Gilman. Those of you who follow football know who that is. One of the classic coaches. And he administered dbol to his team starting in the early 60s. And, you know, we suspect a lot of players on certain NFL teams also were using this stuff in the 60s and into the 70s. The Pittsburgh Steelers were the dominant team. The Dolphins in their early 70s, but then the Pittsburgh Steelers in the mid to late 70s, they won 4 Super Bowls. And I believe a 6-year span, Mobster. And one of the theories today, based on some of the players in those days and some of the players they went up against, was they were using anabolic steroids and other teams were not. So that gave them a huge advantage. They were really able to dominate during that time. So in the Olympics, now the famous thing in the Olympics, I'll let Mobster kind of get into it about Dr. John Ziegler and how he introduced it to Olympic athletes.
Right. So I've referred previously in other podcasts to Randy Roach's Muscle, Smoke and Mirrors, and I've also got Dr. John D. Fair's book on Muscle Town USA, which is specifically about York barbell. So essentially what's happened, Steve, and I'll probably get the years wrong, but essentially what's happened is Dr. John Ziegler has gone over to Russia, and watching the Russian athletes and kind of like says, what the hell's going on here? Because they just got that much better in a very short period of time. Now, of course, we know that experiments have taken place on both sides with regards to early forms of testosterone. In fact, Steve and I covered this in another podcast, right the way back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, identification of testosterone and so on and so forth. So we know that the Russians were experimenting with forms of testosterone. So one of the mythological stories goes that Dr. John Ziegler and a Russian coach were drinking in a bar, such as these things go, Steve, and essentially says, what's the secret? What's the secret? And finds out that they're on some form of testosterone, comes back, talks to Ciba, which was a lab producing steroids, as Steve referenced just now, 1957, but we're talking about circa 1960, and said to them, this is what's going on, and obviously waved the flag a little bit, Steve. We need the American athletes to be on the same level. And this is before, of course, steroids were a big deal in the Olympics. And essentially got a hold of a big batch of early forms of Dianabol. And the story goes thus, that he was supposed to be trying to do it as a study, but it was it was changing the training programs, changing their nutrition, trying to get them more structured. So the parameters were all over the place. And the initial dosages were stuff like 5 milligrams, literally 1 5 milligram pill a day. And they still saw improvements. But this, of course, could have come from the training as well. Later on, and again, this is referring to Randy Roach's book, the guys were not only taking way more than 5 milligrams, stories of they would grab a small handful out of a bowl. One was a particular story. The other one was they found a way to write the prescription at themselves, essentially on a pre-signed pad of prescriptions, and then was going to the pharmacies and getting the prescriptions filled themselves. They were also experimenting with recreational drugs. It was the 60s, guys. But it was definitely why York barbell specifically, and then later, of course, as Steve said, American football and other athletes were all trying to look for an edge, and especially when it comes to the Olympic Games, beating the Russians and so on and so forth. So it's the box was open, Steve. The Pandora's box was open. They'd seen what made things happen. And then, of course, as we're also aware, we've talked about Iron Game history, we could even get into what we've described as the golden age of bodybuilding when we're referencing Arnold and the rest of the gang and earlier athletes down at Muscle Beach in California, and the conversations and the secrets and so on and so forth. So, for example, we've talked about Arnold reportedly, and I don't actually believe this, but reportedly the only reason he was beating other athletes, that's what they thought, of course, is that they was all using dbol, but they thought Arnold was using more dbol and more of other drugs that they managed to get hold of. So yeah, I mean, the other thing is, and I've used this phrase on a podcast before, at some point it even got the euphemism of being called the breakfast of champions, and I think you can still buy a t-shirt with that on. There was mock-ups of certain cereal boxes with dbol as the logo instead of a very well-known brand of cornflakes, and so on and so forth. And even phrases which pre-Viagra Steve used to call the little blue pill, when that was the color that it was produced in. So it's also, and I'll say historically, and again we've referenced this on dbol podcast before, very much until probably the last 20 years or so, the steroid that everybody started with. You started with an oral, and if it was going to be oral, it was almost certainly, I would say 80-90% of the time, 20-30 years ago, Steve, your first steroid, your first dabble, your first toe in the water when it comes to using PEDs was Dianabol. You know, guys have experimented with coffee and caffeine, and even again 60s and 70s, various forms of speed, amphetamines, and so on and so forth. But in terms of anabolics, certainly 20-30 years ago, this applies to me, Steve. What am I talking about now? 22 years ago, my first steroid was dbol. So yeah, very much an athlete's easy to use, very difficult to fuck up, really. Certainly when it comes in comparison, and we're going to talk about dosages and cycling later, to the stacks and multiple PEDs, etc. And honestly, I think you and I have used a phrase before. It's almost fail-safe in terms of how you're going to respond, the way that you're going to feel on it, what's going to happen to your appetite, what's going to happen in the gym, and so on and so forth. But yeah, we're talking about now, guys, when we do this podcast, a few younger listeners, we're talking about steroids sometimes from 100 years ago. And I've talked about how there are hundreds of steroids. dbol is still around. It still has exactly the same effect as we're going to talk about. And we're talking about a steroid that's been used as a PED, probably if not necessarily the first one, in terms of popularity, the steroid from back in 60 years ago, more than 60 years ago, Steve. So what do you think on that?
Yeah, and so we'll get a little bit more in the history. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but back in the 70s, Arnold, what he would do, he would take Primo, which was a very, very dry steroid, and then he add in a handful of Dianabol along with the Primo. Why? Just to give it a little kick, a little energetic kick. In those days, they didn't use testosterone to inject. Very, very risky. There wasn't any ways, they haven't figured out yet how to block aromatization. So they would have to be flexible. And Dianabol does give you the flexibility. Although it does aromatize like crazy, it gives you the flexibility of being in and out of your system much quicker. It's got a very short half-life, 4 or 5 hours. So really, this stuff is going to be in your system. If you take a Dianabol, it's going to be in your system 24 hours total. That's the total life. So obviously, when you take Dianabol, one of the tricks is you want to take it at least twice a day. I would go twice a day, maybe 3 times a day at the most. You don't need to take it more. But this way, it's in your system for the entire 24 hours and doing what we want anabolic steroids to do. Now, Dianabol, I would compare it, and this is the way they design it, exactly like taking oral testosterone. Now, we know oral testosterone. There is an oral testosterone, which is called Andriol, but Andriol is very weak. It doesn't do much in the body because they did not structure it and add a double carbon bond. And they also did not make it 17 alpha alkylated. So that means that it's not going to be effective in the body. It's going to not be able to enter the liver and pass into the body without being destroyed by the liver. So Dianabol That's what they did when it came to testosterone. They switched they manipulated the testosterone molecule to give it those two advantages. So it does go in your body and it actually aromatizes less than testosterone. But because it is so rapid in the body, you will notice rapid water weight gain, and you'll notice what will seem like rapid aromatization, which is happening because it's in and out of your body so quick, but it's still going to aromatize a little less than testosterone. So you can get away with not using an aromatase inhibitor when on Dianabol by itself if you're using a moderate amount. But if you start hiking the dose, you will need an aromatase inhibitor. That would be a good idea. And if you do stack it with testosterone, which I see a lot of people do foolishly, I might add, that you definitely need an aromatase inhibitor. But otherwise, you'll get that moon face and you'll turn into a bloated fish. So if you're going to stack it with testosterone, you do not want to use a lot of testosterone with it, and or you don't want to use a lot of Dianabol with it. So start, you basically, when you're using Dianabol, like Mobster said, the appetite, the mood, everything
Yeah,
is going to go
yeah,
up on it, just like it would on testosterone. You're going to notice that very quick androgenic effect in the body. You'll notice it's like an aggression, but it's a happy aggression. You'll notice
yes.
rapid strength increase in the gym. You'll be
It
on it
feels like
for a week and you'll
yeah.
be able to do, instead of doing 6 reps on the same amount of weight, you'll be able to do 8 reps. It's pretty quick.
Steve and
Go
I have
ahead.
talked about our experiences, Steve, and I think one of the things that I've described, and I'm going to very quickly talk. I said literally, I've taken fake dbol and legit dbol in the same week and put on 4 pounds in 4 days with a legit dbol. And I think there's a thing when I talk about one of the reasons I like it specifically, and that androgenic effect of the water, funny enough, and it's very much described as a wet steroid for that particular reason, is that I will bulk up, certainly back in the past, very quickly. And it gave me that bulk's going to give me better leverage for certain exercises, QED, the bench press, which I've mentioned before. And quite simply, that gives you a confidence. So less aggression, as Steve said. I don't go around going, I'm the big I am on Debo any more than fucking usual, Steve. But I certainly go, right, I'm going to put on this amount of weight. That's going to improve my exercises. That means the bench press. And it gives me that confidence. An extra half inch, quarter inch everywhere is going to give me the confidence to do certain exercises. It's not crazy on the strength, but it helps. Certainly, guys, if you struggle with being ectomorphic, for example, or struggle with eating, struggle with adding weight, and so on and so forth, and you never use a steroid, how good are you going to feel, Steve, putting on 10 pounds in 10, 13, 14 days, certainly over the 4 to 6 week, 8 week cycle? That's an inch all over an average person, an inch all over. That's going to make you feel something different. And I think even Steve's used the phrase before when we talked about dbol in the past, the pumps are the kind of good pumps. We've referred to Anavar being as disabling and certainly very uncomfortable at times. Dbol pumps feel pleasant. So it's definitely, for a lot of people, the experience, and Steve and I are talking from our own personal experience, it's a feel-good steroid. Trent, for example, which I've used very briefly, Steve, it just makes me feel like toxic, even at low dosages. I don't like how I feel. So whereas Debo, I like how I feel. So it's not. I don't use steroids, and I've said this specifically, Steve, to feel good. It's more what it does and how it affects my work in the gym. But this is an added bonus for me, Steve, when I'm using this. Anavar's the same. I know I'm going to get stronger without getting bigger. So we have the experience of using, I haven't used every steroid there is, but multiple steroids nevertheless. And I know exactly how I'm going to feel, exactly the response I'm going to get. And that's from someone who has had quite a bit of experience now over the years versus you, perhaps the listener who's a newbie, never used PEDs, and you go, okay, what am I going to feel like on steroids? Well, that's debol. We can say you can have a great pump. But arguably, the water's going to add a half inch, quarter of an inch at least, even on the average user. Your appetite's going to go up. You're going to feel good. And you're going to feel like something's extra's happening that's never happened before. If you're dieting, you're training on point, so much the better, Steve. So, what's your experience of debol?
Yeah, and it's the same thing, buddy. One of the things though, we got to get into the negatives too, when it comes to Dianabol, because Dianabol, this is serious business. These are serious hormones that we're putting in our body. So really there's two areas where Dianabol causes issues. And
Yes.
actually, I'll do three. There's the androgenic side effects, there's the estrogenic side effects, and then there's the liver toxicity. So remember how I said earlier, 17 alpha alkylated? Well, it does cause liver strain. So you want to make sure that you go into the cycle, with good liver numbers. And you want to make sure you're getting blood work done. Is your liver in bad shape already? Then using Dianabol or any
Yes.
anabolic steroid, regardless, but especially Dianabol, which is 17 alpha alkyl, is not a smart idea. Do you drink alcohol? You don't want to drink alcohol with Dianabol. Not a good idea. It'll send your liver values sky high. So keep that in mind. So it's very important to use liver support when you're using Dianabol, but you want to take the liver support about 90 minutes away from when you dose the Dianabol or any oral steroid. Now, androgenic side effects, the blood pressure increases. Now that ties in. It's a domino effect of the other issues, is the estrogenic side effects. And all that can kind of tie into each other and cause a domino effect. One of the things with Dianabol, like, you can really put on a lot of weight quickly. And when you do that, your blood pressure goes up. It's going to cause insomnia. It's like carrying water all day. You might lose energy and feel fatigued because you're gaining too much weight. So it's important to manage that weight. Very, very important to keep aromatase inhibitors on hand. The Aromacin, the Arimidex, even the Letro. And then I'd keep Nolvadex on hand in case you get gynecomastia issues. Now, gynecomastia is something that we don't want to get. Once you start getting gynecomastia, you've got to take action immediately. I would stop the Dianabol immediately. Once you start getting the itchy nipples, if you start noticing a lump, anything like that, which are the gynecomastia being the bitch tits, you want to stop it immediately. There's gonna be people out there which Dianabol is just not the smart choice for you. If you're
Yeah,
extreme,
I
you
was
gotta
thinking
know
about this,
don't
Steve,
do
just
it.
now. If you're overweight, let's be crude, if you are fat and you have any arguable symptoms of prepubescent or post-pubescent gyno, literally bitch tits, then dbol is not the choice you should be making. Arguably also, Steve, there's another one, right? And I've seen this said about creatine, never mind Dianabol. If you're ripped, if you're lean, and if you like being ripped and lean, but you've decided to add weight, it can freak you the fuck out adding that water on. So you know what I mean, Steve? There's a head fucking fuck here for some people. Don't use. We're talking about dbol, we're saying how great it is, etc., etc. But equally, I say this all the time about all kinds of steroids and all kinds of cycles. You should be, especially now, Steve. This is not a question anymore of only being able to get hold of one steroid. In this case, Dianabol. There are multiple choices, and you should pick the one that suits your purpose, your target, your aim best. I'm just saying that dbol works in a certain particular way, and it's the experience that a great many listeners that have used steroids will have almost certainly used first and had experience of first. But that doesn't mean necessarily now, guys, especially for those of you coming in and want to look a certain way, maybe you do Instagram and you're always lean and showing off your six-pack, etc., etc. dbol wouldn't be the one for you if you have any issues with being overweight. dbol, I certainly wouldn't recommend this for someone who's obese, Steve. Certainly someone who's got man tits, man boobs, whatever. I certainly would not. I said, first, get yourself in shape. And this applies to all steroids again. And we'll talk about the nutrition a little bit here, Steve. You will get better from any PED if your nutrition and training are on point. Now, specifically, in the title today was dbol, Dianabol to bulk. Bulking, and I'll touch on this now, Steve, is specifically getting bigger. Modern terms, it tends to be more lean than the old form, which was half fat and half muscle. It's mostly muscle these days. You will always get better results from any stack if your nutrition is on point and if your training is specifically targeted and aimed at the idea of bulking type exercises, which is always going to be the big compound exercises and so on and so forth. So make sure that's got to go there. Dosaging, Steve. I'll talk about what I've done and touch up on the pros as well. Right, so there's a bunch of arguments in return to cycle length. I've done short cycles, but I've seen arguments saying you should only use orals for 4 weeks. That's bullshit. And Steve and I have actually touched on that in another podcast. I've done multiple oral cycles, dbol included, for 8 weeks. That seems to suit me. Dosage in 30 milligrams a day. That's only 210 milligrams a week, barely TRT, Steve. And I've done incredibly well on that dosage a million times, loads and loads of times. 50 milligrams, I've pushed it to a few times. I didn't get much better results from 50 than I did from 30. So that's a nice low dosage stack right there. I have heard of pro competitors, and this is part of a competition stack. Typically, this will be the beginning because you won't want to be using a lot of an oral steroid at the end, specifically a wet one like Dianabol, up to 100 milligrams a day for a pro competitor. That's where you will see the 2 to 4 week cycles, but that'll be part of a 16-week cycle approaching a competition. That's putting on muscle, getting big, getting strong, using that strength to add more muscle again, and then obviously tweaking the cycle as you go along to come into the day of the competition as big as a house and ripped to the bone. That's the ideal, of course, Steve. So what's your dosage and cycling suggestions?
So with Dianabol, look, back in the day, they would take like a handful of it. They would just pop it in their mouth. That's what these guys have actually said. And so I mean, we can surmise they were taking up to like 50, maybe even 60 milligrams a day. But I think a good dose, if you're gonna run it by itself, I don't think you need more than 20, 30 milligrams a day. And you get really good results on this stuff for, like you said, Mobster, up to 8 weeks, 4 to 8 weeks. For using it as a lot of people like to use it in a kickstart. If you're doing a kickstart, you can do the same thing, 20 to 30 milligrams. I would start there. Now, some guys want to go higher. They want to go to 50 milligrams. In that case, I would definitely add in aromasin to it, which is which is an aromatase inhibitor, and that's gonna block that estrogen conversion. But I really don't think you need that much on Dianabol. It's pretty dummy proof, and you get really, really good results on a lower dose when it comes to Dianabol. So stacking, if you're gonna stack it with something else that aromatizes, you could run into trouble. Testosterone, for example. Let's say let's say you just want to put on a ton of weight, Mobster. You don't care. All right. You're like, yeah, fuck this. I'm sick of being skinny. I want to put on a ton of weight. Then
Yeah.
shit, go on 500 milligrams of testosterone or sustanon or any type of testosterone blend, and then throw in 20, 30, 40 milligrams of Dianabol a day. And I guarantee you the scale will move up. But is it going to be healthy? No. You're going to deal with side effects I talked about earlier, a lot of estrogenic
Yeah.
side effects. You're going to have the moon phase. You're going to be bloated. Your muscles are going to be fluffy. You're going to lose your vascularity, but you're going to get stronger and you're going to get bigger. But is that what you want? Then go for it. Just make sure you're keeping an AI on hand. Even if you don't want to use an AI, keep it on hand in case. Because if something goes wrong, you start developing gynecomastia, you want to get on that AI immediately and to get that estrogen knocked down. So that's an option. But if you want to kind of, like you want to do more the Arnold thing where you're stacking a cutting steroid, a mild steroid with the Dianabol, you can go the Primo plus dbol route. That was very popular back in the day.
Yes.
So in that case, you go 500, 400 to 600. 500 is a sweet spot of Primo. Arnold liked to use 100 milligrams of Primo. Back in the day, they had the 100 milligram amps of Primo. So obviously, it makes sense to just pin 100 milligrams of the Primo every single day, even though it is an NF8 ester. But today we have underground labs that are putting out Primo in 200 milligram a milliliter. So you can literally do 2 cc's of Primo once a week and just be done with it. You don't have to inject it every single day like Arnold had to back in the day. And then you can add in some Dianabol to kind of give things a kick. Kickstarting really any cycle. A lot of people, they'll do equipoise and testosterone or Primo and testosterone, and then they'll use Dianabol to kickstart. And then the Dianabol kickstart, because it's in your system so fucking fast, and those other steroids take a while to build up in your system because they
Yeah.
have longer, slow releasing esters. So a lot of people like to kickstart. I know, Mobster, you're not a big fan of kickstart, but a lot of people like to kickstart, and their number one choice is Dianabol, because Dianabol, you'll feel the Dianabol within days. You'll feel the effects, but you're not going to feel Primo within days. It's going to take a few weeks to really hit your stride with Primo. I would not stack Dianabol with a harsher steroid. I wouldn't stack
Oh,
it with
no, 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 no.
Anadrol, for
No.
example. I wouldn't stack it with Superdrol. We're talking orals. I wouldn't stack it with Tren if we're talking injectables. You're not going to get the effects you want because you stacking it with something that's extremely androgenic. Okay. The problem with that is you're going to end up dealing with some really toxic side effects, because not only are you going to have a massive amount of estrogenic effects on the body, but now you're going to have a massive amount of androgenic effects. And remember, Dianabol is androgenic. Okay. Especially at PED dosages. Now, if you run it at 5 milligrams a day, it's not
Yeah.
going to be very androgenic as a male. But if you run it at 20, 30, 40, 50 milligrams a day, it will be extremely androgenic. It would be the equivalent, Mobster, of running, if you run 50 milligrams of Dianabol, it will be the equivalent of running over 1,000 milligrams of testosterone a week. So keep that in mind. You're going to be dealing with a lot of roller coastering and a lot of domino effects of side effects. So there's no reason to go crazy when it comes to stacking Dianabol. Really, you can just use it by itself or just use it in a kickstart to a cycle and you're good in that situation. But really, as long as the steroid you're stacking it with isn't extremely estrogenic, Ment would be another one. It's way too estrogenic. I would not stack Dianabol with Ment. As long as it's not that, or it's not too androgenic, you could definitely stack it. And a lot of people like to do it. And in fact, Mobster, of all the oral steroids out there, Dianabol, even to this day, is the #1 selling oral steroid. And I believe the reason for that is because guys, number one, like to use it solo. They'll run it for
Yep.
4 or 5 weeks, get really good results, and come off. So it's a nice hit and run steroid. Hey, I want it in January. I want to focus on eating. I want to focus in the gym. I want to bulk up. Let me just hop on Dianabol. That's why people want to use it. It's an absolute great bulker, Mobster. So touch on that a bit, and then
Yeah.
we'll spend a minute each on talking about diet and training on it.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example, Steve. Buddy of mine just recently ran this a little bit. He should have done it better. We actually had a conversation about that. But he was posting stuff on Facebook going, I'm just cooking this food, I'm hungry all the time. And that was, of course, because he'd been in the gym harder. So creating the appetite, and the dbol was adding to that for sure. Something they didn't have back in the day, Steve, which of course we do have now, is organ protectors, and we've had podcasts on those, of course. And as Steve said, they didn't know about the AIs, and these things weren't really readily available, or indeed invented in a couple of cases until later on. So it was very much a hit and miss. See how you get on, see how you respond, talk to your buddy, and have his experience, and so on and so forth. Of course, you guys are listening to podcasts. We have access to information like never before. Steve talked about when, for some users, and I don't actually like this either, as a sort of protocol, wait until you see you've got an issue with gyno or something like that, or the itchy nipples or whatever else. I've never liked that, Steve. I don't like the idea of fixing a problem after the problem started to occur. So I've always been happy to run an AI of any description, depending on the cycle that I'm doing, including Overdex, which is, of course, a CERM, not an AI, right from the very beginning of a stack. It doesn't bother me to, for want of a better phrase, and I think it's even an old wives' tale, losing a few percentage of my gains. I'd rather be safe and protected as best I possibly can, subject to PED use, of course, right from the beginning. Why wait until I get gyno? Yeah, I mean, the other thing I'll touch on, Steve, in terms of the training and diet. Listen, this applies to, there's no point bulking up to immediately do a cycle of dbol or whatever, and then the moment you come off the cycle, lose all your gains. That never made any sense to me. It's the blast and cruise TRT road to nowhere, where you have to take PEDs just to maintain your gains. The truth of the matter is, training, as I said, and nutrition better will give you better results. And post cycle, let's say for argument's sake that I have in the past, because I have gained 10 pounds on a dbol stack of 30 milligrams a day, I will, and certainly did then, expect to keep 60%, about £6 from the £10. And part of the reason I do that is I have changed my diet. If I was only eating 3,000 calories before, and during the stack or the cycle I was eating 3,500 calories, then I need to eat somewhere in the middle there, Steve, 3,300, 3,400 to maintain the new £6 of tissue on top of the tissue I've already got. The same thing applies to strength. I've touched on this before, and I'll let Steve jump in as well. If I was benching 225 pounds, Steve, 2 plates aside on a 45-pound bar before, and I got up to 250, 260 pounds, then I would expect post-cycle not to go back to the 225. You have to give your body, both with nutrition and training, a reason to hold on to the new tissue. What a lot of people do is they go back to what they did before freak out about losing all their fantastic gains and that muscle and how they looked in the mirror, and then go back to the PDs too quickly. And I've actually seen one of our fellow podcasters talk about this recently. I disagree. It's manipulation of diet and training. Now, bulking, and I'll let Steve jump in on this as well, training especially, when bulking, I would focus on the big compound lifts. Steve mentions chin-ups, presses, bench presses, rows, squats. We're not talking about leg extensions or side lateral dumbbell raises or anything like that. The big exercises, the ones that work the most muscle to put on the biggest amount of tissue. You can always sculpt and shape and tone, whatever you want to call it, and cut specially, and do the aesthetic type movements later on. What would you do on a bulk, Steve, in terms of nutrition and training?
Yeah. So on Dianabol, you're going to get more hungry. Hence why it makes a great bulker. That's the whole point of why it was invented in the first place. That's why they came out, because they wanted those effects. They wanted to help people who had those issues putting on weight. And that's why it works so well at bulking. So you want to make sure you're feeding your body good quality foods, good quality whole foods. Cut back on the shakes and the weight gainers and all this other crap. It's so tempting for you skinny guys out there. You know, you're 140 pounds, 150 pounds. You're like, Steve, I want to jump on Dianabol. I want to bulk on it. All right, you have my blessing, but learn to eat first before you hop on it. Don't hop on it and then try to learn how to eat. So if you're sticking to protein powders and weight gainers and protein bars and fast food and all this stuff, it means you don't know how to eat yet. And that's okay. Look, and when I was in college, I was a starving college kid. After work, I'd go to college. It was a cafeteria. That was where I would have to get something to eat. And it was nothing but crap food that I had to eat. You know what I'm saying? So I get it. Okay. I get it. I'm not trying to put anyone down or anything. It happens. Same thing when I was in high school. We used to go out, you know, in high school. Either the high school food was crap, or you got to leave campus for 30 minutes and go eat. And what did you go eat? Fast food. So I get it. I've been there and done that too. But now it's time to get serious. You want to bulk up good quality, high quality foods. Okay, Mobster and I, we don't go eat that garbage. Mobster and I, we prep food every Sunday before football. I spend 2, 3, 4 hours, okay, cooking and prepping my food. I don't think it's that big a deal. All right, so I'll cook my chickens, my red meats, my rice, my vegetables. I'll cut up my fruit. I'll do all that stuff. I'll put them in containers and I'll put them in the refrigerator. And that will be what I eat during the week. That's a great way to prep. I did that back when I used to bulk back in the day, and I used Dianabol. So prep your food properly, good quality, high quality foods. And that's what you need to do. So a lot to get to on this one. Check out our other podcast. Mobster, take us into the disclaimer.
Guys, make sure you come on the forums, check out the article that we're going to attach to this regards dbol, and certainly come on the forums and ask us any more questions you have. Please note, we are not doctors and the opinions are ours. It is our view and based on our experience and views on the topic. Our podcasts are for informational purposes and entertainment only. The freedom of speech and the First Amendment applies.